This picture was drawn almost 100 years ago, and it gives a very good idea of how we in Europe regarded Central Africa at that time, a land of mystery and of terror. And that's scarcely surprising because at that time the whole of Central Africa was virtually unexplored. Only a handful of travellers had managed to enter it. Perhaps the most famous of them was David Livingstone, and on one of his journeys he left for Central Africa and no word came from him for 4 years. There was great public interest in his fate, and the New York Herald decided to send a reporter, Henry Morton Stanley, to look for him. Stanley's own journey became one of the great epics of African exploration. With me now is Cosby Jackson, a traveller who's recently been to Africa to try and retrace Stanley's steps. What particularly interested you in this journey?
I got interested in Stanley when I realized that the maps in his journal didn't correspond with modern maps at all. I went into it carefully, and I realized, of course, that he only had a pocket compass and a watch. And it's not surprising that he went quite a long way wrong. When we arrived in Africa, my wife and I decided we would try and trace exactly where he'd been. The story starts in 1869. David Livingstone had been lost in Africa for 4 years. The world began to wonder where he was, and in fact, whether he was still alive. Newspapers of the day printed maps of Africa showing little more detail than this one, and much was guesswork. One go-ahead newspaper, the New York Herald, had an even more go-ahead owner, James Gordon Bennett. Bennett decided to send someone to find the lost explorer. He chose his star correspondent, Henry Morton Stanley. Stanley believed himself to be an American citizen. He had been virtually adopted and renamed by an American merchant, but he was in fact the illegitimate son of a Welsh farmer, John Rowland. Abandoned by his mother and thrown into the workhouse at 5 years old, ever afterwards Stanley suffered from a feeling of inferiority. In October 1869, Stanley was in Spain. Bennett summoned him by telegraph, and 48 hours later, he was in Paris. On the Place de l'Opéra, over the Café de la Paix, is the Grand Hotel where Bennett was staying. It was nearly midnight, 90 years ago, when Stanley hurried through this door. Stanley went into Bennett's suite. Bennett was in bed. He called Stanley in. This room has not changed since Bennett and Stanley met. At once, Bennett said, "Where do you think Livingstone is?"
I really do not know.
"I'm going to send you to find him. The old man may be in want. Take enough to help him should he require it. Get what news of his discoveries you can. And if you find him dead, bring all proof of his being dead. That is all. Good night, and God be with you."
Good night, sir. What it is in the power of human nature to do, I will do it.
Next morning, Stanley left the most civilized of cities and set off on his long journey to darkest Africa. In those days, all travelers to Central Africa started from the island of Zanzibar. Stanley kept a diary in which he wrote every evening. As we followed in his route, we referred to it constantly.
It was in the early morning that I sailed through the channel that separates Zanzibar from Africa. The noble bosom of the strait bore several dhows speeding in and out of the Bay of Zanzibar with bellying sails.
While he was in Zanzibar, Stanley stayed at the house of the American consul. The old consulate has recently been demolished to make this open space by the sea. From its veranda, Stanley must often have looked across at that mysterious land which he was so soon to enter. Zanzibar can have altered little since he was there. The fine new cathedral certainly was not there. Here where my wife Peggy is walking, the Arab auctioneers stood and took bids for the black slaves dragged in thousands from the interior of Africa. Stanley must have enjoyed the sights of Zanzibar just as much as we did.
I strolled through the city. Crooked narrow lanes, streets smelling very strong, black bodies, woolly heads, people sitting, chatting, laughing, bargaining.
A coffee cellar. It's a halfpenny a glass. roasted corn cobs, a penny apiece. Zanzibar's Dhow harbour is as fascinating as ever.
A shallow inlet with dhows, boats, and canoes. Dhows from Muscat and Kutch, traders between India, the Persian Gulf, and Zanzibar.
This is the house of Tipo Tib, a celebrated Arab trader who helped Stanley to fit out his expeditions. His portrait, painted from life, is in Zanzibar Museum. The Arabs stole Stanley mainly three things: cloth, beads, and brass wire. He needed these for barter to buy food and hire porters in the interior. Here lived Dr. Kirk, Livingstone's agent. Stanley got little information from him. Hoping for a scoop for his newspaper, he had concealed his real interest in the lost explorer. Stanley also visited the Sultan in the old palace, now a ruin. The present Sultan lives in this modern palace. Stanley was granted permission to go, provided the red flag of Zanzibar waved with the stars and stripes over his expedition. From this beach, Stanley embarked. He began loading 7 tons of stores, 20 soldiers, 2 horses, 16 donkeys, and a dog. He had enlisted 2 Europeans as his lieutenants, Shaw a Cockney and Farquhar a Scot, both sailors. They were nowhere to be found.
They were found after a vigorous hunt among the liquor shops, trying to stave off, with the aid of whiskey, the dread presentiments that would insidiously now and then obtrude themselves. Get into the dhows at once, men. We're all in for it now, sink or swim, live or die, none can desert his duty.
On February the 5th, 1871, they sailed in 4 dhows from Zanzibar to Africa. Some 10 hours later, they dropped anchor in the little African harbour of Bagamoyo. It has scarcely changed since Stanley waded ashore nearly 100 years ago.
I selected a house near the western outskirts of the town where there is a large open space through which the road runs.
We couldn't find this house, but Peggy discovered its site. The local judge said it had stood here where the Germans had built this pillbox in 1914, and old men confirmed this tradition. After finding a house, Stanley went to dine at the mission. This particular building was put up while Stanley was searching for Livingstone, but one of the fathers showed Peggy the site of the old place. Today, the mission teaches boys to become the leaders of an independent Tanganyika. We watched one of the fathers showing a slave ring to some of his pupils and demonstrating how the slaves were shackled by the neck and led in strings to the coast along the hundreds of miles of slave track which Stanley proposed to follow. Some weeks passed pleasantly while Stanley collected the 150 porters he needed to carry his 7 tons of stores.
We enjoyed our matutinal bath in the sea, and we were engaged in multitudinous preparations for our departure for the interior.
There are now a few modern houses in Bagamoyo, but otherwise it is little different from the old slave days. There is a change for the better. It was around this tree that slaves were sold at auction less than 100 years ago. Now it is a village market and lorry park.
On 21st March, the 5th caravan, led by myself, left Bagamoyo on our journey westwards.
We took the same route. It was said in Stanley's day, a wheel would be as great a novelty in Central Africa as a polar bear. In fact, a wheel cart turned out to be merely a burden.
Shaw, once a mate of a ship, now transformed into rear guard, was wearing a canoe-like topee and sea boots.
It was along this well-worn slave route that Stanley marched until he came to his first obstacle, the Calgary River. It took days to ferry the 200 men, women, children and animals across in the only type of boat available, dugout canoes exactly similar to this. It was just before the rains. Day after day they tramped in single file, elephant grass on either side, and God knows what underfoot. The rains brought sickness. Tsetse fly killed both his horses and infected his men. These are tsetse fly on our truck. They bite like red-hot needles, and we closed our windows to keep them out, but we stifled and had to open up again. Even in the worst conditions, Stanley wrote of the people in his diary and sketched.
A more comical picture is seldom presented than that of one of these females engaged in the homely and necessary task of grinding corn.
In Africa, customs in country villages change little. After a month of travel, the caravan had covered just over 100 miles, an average of about 4 miles a day, and was nearing the town of Simbamweni. Peggy and I got a lot of help from an African Catholic priest who was an expert in the history of the district. We talked with villagers on the spots where Stanley had camped. Few who have written about Stanley's journey realize that old Simbamweni is actually modern Morogoro. A few weeks after Stanley passed, disaster swept this town away. A cathedral is now rising on its site. Modern Morogoro is a typical up-country African town. Good buildings are springing up. Wide roads take the place of the tracks Stanley knew. Not far off lies the grave of the Sultana who ruled in Stanley's time. She treated him and his men badly. Retribution came quickly. This river rose with the exceptional rains and washed away much of her city. It was never rebuilt. At his riverside camp after leaving the city, Stanley had an attack of malaria, the first of many. It is hardly surprising.
The site of the camp was a hotbed of malaria, unpleasant to witness, an abomination to memory. The filth of generations of porters had gathered innumerable hosts of creeping things.
Happily, nature has covered all this, but one can still see that it must have been very wet and unpleasant in the rains. Worse was to follow. 20 miles ahead were the swamps of the Mkata River.
The 1st of May found us struggling through the mire and water of the Makata, with the caravan bodily sick from the exertion and fatigue of crossing so many rivers and wading through marshes. The virtue of a good whip was well tested by me on this day.
There was no question of our following the same route as Stanley. Modern roads avoid this bad area. Around the swamp are the tracks we followed. They were bad enough in the dry weather and quite impassable in the rains. It took Stanley a full week to cross the swamps. Our detour, indifferent as it was, only took a few hours. Eventually, worn out, the expedition struggled up the gentle slopes of these foothills. They are now covered with huge estates of sisal, a cactus which produces fibre for all sorts of purposes, one of the main exports of Tanganyika. We met the Africans who work on these estates and found them rather primitive. The women still mutilate their upper lip in this extraordinary way. One tribe, until recently said to be cannibals, were holding a ritual dance. so often on the old slave route, we came to a mission. After resting 4 days, Stanley's caravan plunged once more into the forest. It was hot and sticky. Then they came on the Mokondokwa River, which they followed for a week. At last, all the caravans assembled on the shores of Lake Gombo. The 2 lieutenants had had quite enough of Africa. Farquhar was sick, suffering from elephantiasis, though the tough Stanley thought he was shamming. Shaw was sick too and was rude. Stanley knocked him down.
"Servant be damned," he said to me. But before Mr. Shaw could finish his sentence, he had measured his length on the ground.
The shores of Lake Gombo that night saw an attempt at murder.
As I was about falling asleep, I heard a shot, and a bullet tore through my tent a few inches above my body. I snatched my revolvers and rushed out. "Who shot? Shaw, did you fire?"
Shaw denied it, but his gun was warm. In spite of this, matters were patched up. Peggy and I particularly wanted to see the scene of these extraordinary events, and a friend from a nearby railway station showed us this dugout canoe, which surely dated from Stanley's time. The slave route on was easy going for the expedition.
The road led up a dry riverbed clear to the camp at Mpwapwa.
Stanley's porters camped under these trees. Stanley, Shaw and Farquhar lived further up the hill. He pitched his tent under this old tree, and he also stayed here on his way back to the coast many months later. Fortunately, we were able to get detailed information about Stanley at Mpwapwa. Some years ago, the district commissioner questioned 2 old men who had actually seen Stanley, and he made a record of all they had told him. At Mpwapwa, the ailing Farquhar was left behind. 5 days later, he died. Under this thorn tree, we literally unearthed his grave, which had been covered by floods. When Stanley came back and learnt of his death, he carved Farquhar's and Livingston's name on a stone nearby. They are still readable. The local tribesmen had gathered in Mpwapwa while we were there to celebrate the Queen's birthday. These are the descendants of the dreaded Wagogo tribe of Stanley's time. They are still pretty tough, but they love a dance. After halting 3 days, Stanley moved on once more in his search for Livingston. At the bitter springs of Chunyo, 3 of his donkeys drank and died. By now there were very few left. Then began a series of forced marches through the country of the hostile Wagogo.
The houses of the Wagogo are square, and the roofs are all flat, on which are spread the grain, herbs, tobacco, and pumpkins.
Stanley didn't like the Wagogo. They took so much tribute off him.
An evil-minded race.
But we found them pleasant and friendly.
The march to Bihawana, our next camp, was rugged and long. Several sandy watercourses were passed on this march. The sun seemed to scorch all vitality.
Viawana is another mission of the White Fathers. The Italian bishop showed us where Stanley had passed by on the slave route. He pointed out the baobab tree under which he had camped. According to Arab legend, the baobab tree made the devil lose his temper when he sought shade under it. Leafless when all other trees have leaves, it gave the evil one no shelter, so he turned it upside down. Stanley drove his porters on, never daunted, never doubting that he would find Livingstone. Ahead lay the high plateau of central Tanganyika, and the expedition started to climb out of the Wagogo country.
The ascent of the ridge was rugged and severe. Thorns of the prickliest nature punished us severely. Steep outcrops of granite, once smoothed by many feet, had to be climbed over.
In the swamps, the roads were very bad, as they still are. Stanley was nearing the great Arab encampment of Tabora. Now the slave route has been obliterated by Tabora Airport. The only track we saw were marks made by a snake, possibly python or deadly mamba. 3 months and 500 miles from his starting point, Stanley now reached the village of the chief of Tabora. The ruins of his house still stand. Nearby is the residence of the present chief. In front of his baraza hut, where he holds court, stands his regalia, a fetish tree and 2 little houses of straw. Offerings to the spirits are still hung on the tree, a slave ring and a skull of lions. The chief's drums are used on all big occasions. We couldn't have them actually sounded. The noise would have summoned his people from miles around. His execution rock on the edge of the village, where criminals were pegged out in the broiling sun to die, and the vultures did the rest. This is the house where Stanley stayed at Tabora. It was having its roof restored when we got there, so we had plenty of light to see inside the rooms where he lived. On the walls are framed pages from the New York Herald of dispatches Stanley wrote whilst at Tabora. Modern Tabora is an important town as well as a market for the surrounding country. Dried whitebait, a delicacy from Lake Tanganyika 300 miles away, a distance which Stanley still had to cover. Tabora today has secondary schools up to European standards. It is also a railway instruction centre where young Africans are trained from models and with the real thing for the higher posts in the East African Railway. His way blocked by hostile tribes, Stanley was held at Tabora for 3 months. Even up to this point, he had not told Shaw where he was going. Shaw was ill, dying, and the knowledge that Stanley thought Livingstone was at Ujiji certainly didn't revive him.
I have decided to lead a flying caravan to Ujiji by a southern route.
Such an effort was too much for Shaw. Much of the journey was through game country.
Herds of large and varied game browsing within easy rifle range. Here at last was a hunter's paradise.
The route became difficult again.
This marsh presented a breadth of some 100 yards on which grew a close network of grass. In the center of this and under it ran a broad, deep, and rapid stream.
This obstacle threw him into a fever of anxiety because he'd heard a rumor of a white man on the shores of Lake Tanganyika.
This is Livingston. It must be Livingston.
Further delays were caused by the local tribes. Their extortionate demands were impossible to meet. The women still wear the anklets made of brass wire, which Stanley had to pay. Even today, all the men seem to carry spears and look the type who would not be afraid to use them. He fled through the forest, dodging the men who were burning the countryside to make the grass grow green, just as they do to this day. Stanley knew now he was within a few hours of his goal.
We crossed the Makuti, a glorious little river.
He was nearing his last night's camp.
I told Selim to chalk my helmet and fold a new puggree round it, to lay out my new flannel suit, for the clothes I had worn through jungle and forest are in tatters, and to oil my boots.
It was the 3rd of November and the 236th day from Bagamoyo. He had only a march of 6 hours to Ujiji to find out if Livingston really was there.
It is a happy, glorious morning. The sky lovingly smiles on the earth and her children. Forward! In 2 hours, I am warned to prepare for a view of the Tanganyika. There it is, a silvery gleam. We push on rapidly.
Under the mango trees, the slave route was clearly marked to Ujiji. He arrives at the summit of the last ridge.
Ujiji is below us, embowered in the palms, only 500 yards from us. Unfurl your flags and load your guns.
They fire a salute as the people come out to greet them. An African runs up and says he is one of Dr. Livingston's servants. Stanley moved to the opening ranks of his own men, preceded by a soldier carrying the stars and stripes on the end of a spear.
I would have run towards him, only I was a coward in the presence of such a mob. Would have embraced him, only he, being an Englishman, I did not know how he would receive me. So I did what cowardice and false pride suggested was the best thing. Walked deliberately to him, took off my hat, and said, "Dr. Livingston, I presume."
The news of this meeting astounded the civilized world months later, and Stanley's greeting has passed into history. This simple memorial marks the place where Stanley and Livingston met.